The swimming dive start is highly linked to overall performance during competition. The start can contribute anywhere between 0.8 to 26.1% of total race time, depending on race distance. An efficient start in all the swimming events depends on the great combination of the actions on the block and the swimmer's projection to the water in order to positively influence the subsequent phases: the block phase, the flight phase, and the entry phase. The block phase is the stationary phase, the moment the athlete is on the blocks before the start of the race. The position of the body on the block is crucial to produce a well-performed dive. Having a fast reaction off the blocks plays a role in this also. The reaction time needs to be as brief as possible, while the movement phases on the block need to last long enough to maximize the swimmer's impulse to achieve high horizontal velocity. Initial forces generated in this phase as the swimmer is stationary. Arms are centralizing the center of gravity as the weight of the swimmer is leaning toward the front of the block, creating an opposing reaction of force, allowing the swimmer to propel themselves forward off the block. Quadricep muscles are predominantly used during this motion. The superior force of the hamstrings and gluteus maximus will contract simultaneously. Swimmers are able to double their flight distance and acceleration if positioned correctly. The legs are apart for the track start, one behind the other, with the dominant foot in front being their base of support. The toes are gripping the block as well as the hands. The body is in a crouch position with an equal amount of weight on both legs, and the head is central. The stability refers to the resistance to the curvilinear movement from a balanced position. The swimmer's both legs are clearly producing flexion at the knee, the front leg at 140 degrees and the back leg at an optimal of 90 degrees. These angles will engage in the initial force produced off the block to achieve maximal distance. Shoulder flexion is also occurring at 120 degrees. The flight phase is the moment when the swimmers react and leave the blocks to before they enter the water. During this phase, the swimmer needs to propel themselves as far as possible off the block on a curvilinear path and travel the maximum distance at high velocity. The projectile is the swimmer. The forces that impact the projectile in this phase are gravity and air resistance. The angle of dive into the pool channels the power, amount of force, momentum, and acceleration produced from the explosive takeoff. Therefore, horizontal velocity should be increased and vertical velocity decreased. By the block already having an angle, and some may have a kicker, allows a greater angle of momentum. The center of gravity changes through inertia while the swimmer is in motion. It rolls outside the body, allowing the swimmer to maximize explosive power as the body passes the front of the block and the back leg is extended to generate power off the block, being at an optimal of 180 degrees. The front leg dominates the ability to produce increased levels of resultant force at an angle of 130 degrees. The orientation of the feet are in plantar flexion to produce the optimal streamline position. This generating the accumulated forces, substantial forces of torque in this phase. The speed of release works in relation to the angle of release, as the greater the speed of the projectile will create greater distance. An optimal angle of launch is 60 degrees. This will allow the swimmer to exert power throughout their whole body. This swimmer's angle of entry is at 50 degrees, but still achieve speed off the block. Swimmers are able to double their power of flight if they achieve an optimal angle of takeoff while avoiding any possible injuries. If the angle of takeoff is too high, the angle of entry will be too steep, reducing flight distance. If the swimmer's angle is too low, then the entry will be flat. This results in increasing the drag component. Fatal head and back injuries are common in diving into shallow water or diving incorrectly or too deep. This swimmer is over 6 foot tall. Height plays a minimal role in the dive, but swimmers who have longer limbs and therefore longer levers add more range of motion and can produce more in the flight phase of the dive and elongate the dive itself, creating more range. The ability of the arms to generate downward and backward forces on the feet should not be underestimated. The movement is produced in this phase by the flexion of the elbows being at 90 degrees, again producing a greater amount of acceleration through the resistance of the air. The stance on the block is crucial to any coach or clinician teaching or educating a swimmer on their dive, as the angle depicts the outcome of the entire skill. The entry phase is when the swimmer transitions into the optimal streamline position and enters the water. The arms being in a streamline position influences and enhances the biomechanical variables of momentum, acceleration, and velocity. The streamline helps the swimmer to experience minimal drag and resistance and therefore increase their forward momentum distance. It is crucial to coaches and clinicians that the swimmer keeps their head and arms down and their arms must enter the water one hand on top of another while their upper body enters and the hips extend to align with the legs and the trunk in an optimal streamline position while keeping the joints and limbs tight. Hyperextension of the arms is executed in this phase. Plantar flexion is occurring at the feet. The legs are producing extension at an optimal of 180 degrees angle, as well as the back and the shoulders are pointing directly upwards, producing flexion. By the swimmer starting on the block with legs one in front of the other, it creates a smaller hole that is optimal for entry with a higher velocity due to the influence of gravity, but requires a horizontal body position from the surface, then vertical until the underwater phase occurs. This minimizing the surface area of the body as the swimmer enters the water to continue the creative momentum and velocity. Newton's first law of motion can impact by the hands not being in a streamlined position as the water pushing against the swimmer is an unbalanced force. Incorrect positioning of the hands can impact the dive as a whole and lead to possible fatal head and spine injury if they hit the bottom of the pool, spending a long period of time underwater, impacting their overall performance if they are struggling for oxygen. To achieve optimal strand position as the similarly as the blocks, their arms need to be driven upwards forcefully to increase the ground reaction forces from the blocks.